right, welcome back, everyone. This is CS480, 680 Introduction to Machine Learning, as taught at the University of Waterloo in fall 2024. This is lecture 14, and today we're going to be talking about convolutional neural networks, which is a type of deep network with a particular architecture that makes it really powerful for image data in particular. But so why do we need an architecture other than the multi-layer perceptron that we saw before? And so the world increasingly needs algorithms to process image data. So let's assume for the sake of argument that we've got an image with 1 megapixel resolution. So this would correspond to 1 million pixels, and in an MLP, that would correspond to 1 million input features. And if we had a hidden layer of 1,000 neurons, that would mean that we would have 1 billion parameters in our model. Training that up would require a ton of data, cost us a ton in compute, and then we might end up risk overfitting on the result after all of that is said and done. So can we do any better than multi-layer perceptrons for processing image data? And so this goal of processing image data, it's a bit amorphous. So let's carve off the sub-problem of detecting an object, like a lane marker in an image of a highway scene. So we can think a bit about some of the unique properties of image data. So for one, if we were to zoom in on some little patch of this image, like this magnified, section on the left here, that this is the lane marker up close. So on one hand, there's a smooth gradient, but then there's a sharp edge as we transition from the lane marker itself in white to the concrete, to the asphalt rather. And so this abrupt change, these abrupt changes that we see from one pixel to the next, they're informative because they indicate the boundary between edges. And so what this means is that even if we focus on small regions within an image, we've ignored everything else that's going on in this image. We can learn quite a bit by focusing on small patches at a time. And so this reflects, a locality principle. Essentially, nearby pixels are going to contain information that help us understand the position of objects within an image. Focusing on individual small regions at a time before trying to deal with the whole image as a whole. But before trying to deal with the image as a whole. So if we just focus locally, you can identify individual line segments, potentially, recognize the mountains or where the curb sets in, and then combine the information that you learned about the local features to be able to make sense of the information overall later on. And so a natural approach to detecting where the lane is would be to slide that patch that we defined in the last slide, slide that over the whole image. So go along every, starting off in one row, go along every column, and then eventually you would find out where that patch lined up with your actual image. And so that's a natural approach, but what the assumption that you've implicitly made is that whatever method used to recognize the lane marker shouldn't be overly concerned with the precise location of the object in the image. And so this leads us to another fundamental property that you would want your computer vision system to have, which is spatial invariance. And so what that means is that your system should be able to identify the lane marker regardless of its exact position within the frame. And so whether the lane marker is to the left or to the right, maybe down the road somewhat, you want our system to be able to detect it regardless of where it is. So whereas the That locality principle helped us, focus on specific regions without needing to look at the entire image at once. Spatial invariance would mean that we would apply that lane marker detection approach over the whole image, or anywhere in the image. Um, yeah, this would be a robust way to identify features that might appear in various locations. And it's actually the foundation of many object detection and segmentation algorithms. Remarkably, the visual system of mammals exploits these assumptions of locality and spatial invariance in the perception of visual scenes. Specifically, there are cells in the visual cortex that respond to precisely these kinds of edges that we would need to find lane markers in a highway scene. So I'm going to play a short video linked at the bottom here, where the scientists that discovered these cells, Hubel and Wiesel, they talk about the discovery that changed our understanding of visual processing. So for anyone who missed what was going on there, what they did was they placed a microelectrode near a single neuron in the primary visual cortex of an anesthetized cat, and then they, were projecting light and dark dots into the cat's eye, and they were expecting to get some responses from the neuron, but nothing happened. There was no response from the cell at all. But then there was a bit of a lucky accident. And so because they were using a slide projector to present the stimuli, the edge of the slide itself was also projected into the cat's eye. And that's what caused the neuron to fire. And so this unexpected response, it led them to realize that certain cells in the visual cortex were specifically tuned to detect edges and not points of light. Hubel and Wiesel went on to investigate the mammalian visual system rigorously, and they ran experiments with bars at different orientations, and that led to the discovery that cells have an orientation selectivity. So on the left here are different bars with different orientations that were presented as stimuli to show how cells respond more intensely to specific orientations. So for example, this is a bar at roughly 45-degree angle, slightly more vertical, perfectly vertical, and then we're rotating away at increments. And then on the right here are shown how the cell in question responds to this particular stimulus. And specifically, there's 3 epochs, or we're going to be talking about 3 epochs. So before the stimulus is presented, and then during the stimulus presentation period, and then after it's taken away. So in this first row, we're presenting a bar at a 45-degree angle, and so there's and then time proceeds from left to right. And so when the stimulus is not there, the cell's not firing at all. But then when the stimulus is presented, we can see that there's a couple spikes. So 1, 2, 3 spikes, the cell fires 3 times. And then after the stimulus is taken away, there's only one spike. Um, Now the stimulus is presented at a slightly more vertical angle. And during the stimulus presentation period, we get 4 spikes instead of 3. When the bar is at a perfectly vertical angle, we're getting quite a few spikes. So a very strong response to this vertical bar. And then as we rotate the bar away from that vertical angle, we're getting less and less spikes during the stimulus presentation period. And so we could aggregate this data to generate a plot of the cell's response, so the number of spikes that occurred during the stimulus presentation period against the orientation of the bar. And that would give us a tuning curve, which would show that the cell's response is strongest at its preferred angle, and then it decreases when the orientation of the bar diverges from that ideal. Hubel and Wiesel called cells with these types of tuning curves simple cells, because they're really acting as line detectors. They're responding most strongly when a bar of light appears with a specific orientation in the visual field. And so their activity is very selective. They're firing at a higher or lower rate depending on the orientation of the bar. But visual processing wouldn't be very interesting if it stopped at those simple cells. And by 1962, Hubel and Wiesel had characterized a counterpart to simple cells that they called complex cells. And they're broader in their selectivity. And so on the right here is a hierarchy in which complex cells receive input from several simple cells. And so in their model, complex cells pool information from multiple simple cells. And so pooling is key here because it refers to how complex cells aggregate signals from many simple cells. And the pooling gives complex cells broader selectivity and enables them to respond to more generalized inputs, like lines that might vary slightly in position or orientation. And so pooling allows the visual system to preserve key features like orientation, even if there's slight shifts or shifts in the orientation. And then as we move higher in this hierarchical structure, pooling is going to continue to play an essential role. Cells at the next level are going to combine information from multiple complex cells, and that's going to enable them to recognize combinations of lines to form more complex patterns. And then at the very highest levels of the visual hierarchy, cells are going to pool information to be able to detect shapes, to recognize very complex and specific combinations of lines. And so this hierarchical and pooled structure in the brain really was direct inspiration for the design of convolutional neural networks as we know them today. And so this, as we're going to see throughout this lecture, convolutional neural networks are going to process visual data in layers, and each layer is going to apply a set of filters to detect features like edges in the biological visual system. There's also going to be pooling layers within CNNs that are directly inspired by this biological pooling. And so these the biological visual, our understanding of visual processing or visual perception in biology, that and computer vision with convolutional neural networks, these two fields really did grow up together. And convolutional neural networks is perhaps the strongest example of a biologically inspired neural network architecture. And it's really straightforward to understand how a convolutional neural network works by relating it back to the biology. And so the task of early practitioners and algorithm designers was to make specific how visual data was represented or could be represented in a computer to the point where we could actually run it on a computer. So they had to specify how features could be detected, and then also get specific about those pooling operations that were being performed. And so in this lecture, we're first going to talk about how a network can detect those low-level features like lines or edges. And we're then going to talk about how a network can detect higher level features from those lower level features. All right, so on to that question, onto that first question. How can a network actually detect low level features? So as the name suggests, convolutional neural networks are based on a fundamental concept called convolution. Convolution, in turn, is a mathematical operation that combines two real valued functions in a way that emphasizes where certain features align. So we can think of an image as a function of pixel positions because it takes in coordinates I and j and returns the value of the pixel at position ij. And then the other function is going to be the convolutional kernel. And so this is a small matrix of values. Usually it's much smaller than the input image I. So yeah, sorry, let me back up. So if I is the input image, and then we're given the other input convolutional kernel K, and then the resulting output of the convolution is going to be S, and another word for this is going to be the feature map. And then the output at position ij, that's calculated by adding up all of the products of the corresponding values in the image patch and the kernel. Specifically, for each position ij in the output S, we're going to compute the sum of the products at I of I plus m and then j plus n with k at m and n. And then we're going to do that for each element in the kernel. So m and n are the indices that go over the rows and columns of the kernel. And then we're going to shift the kernel across the entire image to compute S at ij for each position ij to give us the full output feature map. And so this output, that's going to be a transformed version of the input image that highlights features that are defined by the kernel itself. Technically, what I've written here is called cross correlation, as real convolution would involve flipping the kernel. While this is technically different, in practice, both operations are commonly referred to as convolutional neural networks. Regardless of whether the kernel is flipped or not, typically only matters in a few specific contexts. Convolution has a nice property called translation equivariance. And this means that if we shift an object in the input image, this shift is also going to appear in the output feature map. So for example, if you apply a transformation function g that shifted every pixel of the input image I to the right by 1 pixel. So yeah, if you define some transformation that gives you some image I prime, that's the original image I with each pixel shifted 1 unit to the left. Yeah, you would get the same result, right? So if you did that transformation and then applied and then did the convolution with some kernel K, you would get the same result as if you had first done the convolution with the original image and then applied the transformation to the output of that convolution. And so that this property is incredibly useful in convolutional neural networks because it allows the model to detect features in an image regardless of where they appear. And so this property contributes to CNN's capacity to recognize an object or pattern, even if it's in a different position in the image. So before we go on, yeah, let's make sure that we actually understand convolution. So it'd be useful at this point to pause the video to see if you can compute the output of a convolution operation between this input image and this kernel. And specifically see if you can determine the first element, so the top left element of the top left element. Okay, so yeah, what happened there? So what we did was we took this kernel and started off by placing it in the top left-hand corner. And then we did pairwise multiplications between the corresponding positions of the input image and the kernel, and then summed up all the results. So we went 0 times 0, just give us 0, plus 1 times 1 is 1, plus 3 times 2 is 6, plus 1 is 7, plus 4 times 3 is 12, plus the original 7 is 19, to get that value of 19 there. And then we would move our kernel to compute the output at a different position. We would move the kernel to a different position on the input image, and then apply the same multiply and add operations to get the corresponding value at the output image. Okay, so we've encountered convolution, but how is this practically useful? So yeah, let's consider this binary input image on the left. And this has a thick column of zeros in the middle, and then there's some ones on each side. And so this input image, yeah, is going to help us understand how convolutional kernels can act as something called filters. So let's consider this kernel here. So it's got a height of 1 and a width of 2, and the respective values are 1 and -1. So when we perform convolution with this kernel, we're going to slide it across this input image. And then what we're going to get is this output here. And so why did this happen? So what we can see is that where any two horizontally adjacent elements are the same in the input, the output is 0. But when the elements differ, like when we move from a 1 to a 0 or a 0 to 1, then the output becomes non-zero. And so yeah, in the output, we only see non-zero values at the edges of the central column of the input image. And so these non-zero values, they highlight the transitions between regions of ones and zeros in the output. So this is because the regions are either positively correlated with the kernel we identified. So in this case, there's positive correlation there, or there's negative correlation, like in the other edge. So that this particular kernel is a special case of a finite difference operator. This is a basic method for detecting edges or boundaries in image. It's a discrete approximation of the first derivative in the horizontal direction specifically. And so it captures horizontal changes in pixel intensity. If we were to transpose this kernel, though, then the output would be all 0, because it never matches. It never matches. There's always 0 correlation between the patch in the input image and the kernel. So convolutional kernels can be customized to detect specific patterns like edges in a particular direction within an image. If you were paying attention, you might have noticed that these convolution examples, we were losing pixels around the border by applying the convolution operation. And so this is a tricky issue when applying convolutions, is that we yeah, we tend to lose pixels around the perimeter of our image. And so a straightforward solution to this problem is to add extra pixels of filler around the boundary of the input image. And so yeah, on the left here, the value we've got values ranging from 0 to 8 in the center, and then we've surrounded that with a perimeter of zeros, and then the dashed lines indicate that this is the added padding. And yeah, and so with this padding, or without this padding, only the inner pixels would have valid values in the output, which would reduce the overall size of the output. In this case, we can produce an output that is a 4 by 4 matrix. And if we were to carefully select the amount of padding and the size of the kernel, we could keep the output size the same as the input size, even after applying multiple layers of convolution. Specifically, the total amount of padding that you might want to add should be 1 less than the size of the kernel along the corresponding dimension. And so in this example, if we had instead selected a 3 by 3 kernel, we would have had the same size output as input. So that yeah, we would have been able to get a 3 by 3 output instead of a 4 by 4 output. So yeah, the padding trick allows us to extract more information from the edges of the image and maintain original spatial dimensions, provided you carefully select the kernel size and the amount of padding. So yeah, hopefully by now you're convinced that convolution is useful for detecting features in the image, and that we have a simple trick of padding to counteract pixel loss. But today's lecture is about neural networks. So, how is convolution implemented in a neural network? And so to do this, convolutional neural networks rely on 2 principles, specifically sparse connections and parameter sharing. And yeah, to make sense of sparse connections, let's recall the connections in a multi-layer perceptron. So that's shown here at the top. So in MLPs, every output unit is connected to every single input unit. So for example, this highlighted input node X3, that's connected to every output node, S1 through S5. And so we say that this makes the layer dense. Yes, the traditional approach are also known as fully connected networks, and each input unit has its own parameter to describe the interaction between the input and the output unit. In convolutional neural networks, those connections are sparse. In this setup, the same input unit might only be connected to 3 nearby output units, S2, S3, and S4. And so this reduced connectivity that's achieved by making the convolutional kernel smaller than the input, so that it only sees a small region at a time. And so this is what we mean by sparse interactions. There's only a limited number of outputs that are affected by a given input. To tie this back to the convolution operation, another way to think about sparse interactions is in terms of the number of pixels that can influence each unit in the hidden layer. So in a fully connected network, each input node is connected to every output node. So every input, X1 through X5, that's going to influence every output, including S3. In a convolutional neural network, each output unit only connects to a subset of the input units through a set of weights defined by the convolutional kernel. So for example, this output unit S3, it's only interacting with 3 input units, X2, X3, and X4. This small set of inputs is known as the receptive field of S3. and it represents the limited area of the input that S3 sees or responds to. So yeah, the kernel weights in a CNN act like a small filter in a local region. Local connectivity, yeah, that's actually not enough to implement convolutional over entire image though. And so we also need the weights in the kernel to be applied uniformly across all receptive fields as it slides over the input. And this is gonna be crucial to allow the CNN to detect the same features in the different parts of the image. And so this concept is called parameter sharing. And it's one of the keys to make convolutional neural networks also efficient as well as powerful. And so the idea is that we're going to reuse the same parameters across the entire input to allow CNNs to recognize patterns consistently, regardless of where they appear in the image. So for example, in a fully connected network, each connection between inputs and outputs, that's going to have its own distinct parameter. So for example, the central weight used to connect S3 to S3, that's a unique connection, a unique parameter that's not used anywhere else. And so every such connection, yeah, is going to have its own parameter. And so we're going to have a lot of parameters, in this network. In a convolutional neural network, though, instead of unique weights for each connection, a single kernel of weights is shared across different parts of the input. And so these black arrows, they might indicate the central element of a kernel, and we're gonna reuse that across different input locations. And so that this shared kernel is applied uniformly. So the same weights are going to be used as the kernel slides over the input. And so by sharing parameters in this way, convolutional neural networks are going to are going to be in position to detect the same feature, like an edge, regardless of where it appears in the input. And so this is going to allow us to replicate that property of convolution known as translation equivariance. So yeah, parameter sharing converts CNNs with translation equivariance. And so what that means is that if there were a feature that were to shift to a different location, the CNN's output would also reflect this feature at the corresponding shifted location. And so that's possible because the same filter is going to be applied consistently across the image. So yeah, bringing this all together, the activations of units in the hidden layer corresponding to one set of weights or one kernel, we can think of that as an image with some processing applied. But like we saw with the edge detector earlier, we need to apply multiple filters in order to be sensitive to different shapes and patterns. And so each filter is going to capture a unique aspect of the input to allow the network to detect a variety of different patterns within the same image. And so, for example, if we had this image of a tiger, and we applied a vertical edge detector as well as a horizontal edge detector, we would end up with two processed versions of the image to highlight different features based on the specific filter we used. And a consequence of applying multiple filters is that we're going to increase the dimensionality of the data as we go deeper. So we're effectively going to create a stack of images that is as deep as the number of kernels we specified. Yeah, each of these gray boxes represents a different channel responding to different features. And so some slices might highlight those sharp details or edges. Others might pick up, broader, smoother textures or something else. And so we're going to be stacking these channels, and the network's going to build a multidimensional representation of the image, where each slice is going to focus on different information. And so we're going to refer to the number of feature maps as the channel depth. In other words, instead of just one one feature, we're going to apply multiple convolutions in parallel to increase the channel dimension from the input image to that of the hidden. Uh, one thing I've kind of ignored up to this point is that most images have multiple input channels to represent color. And this is useful for many computer vision tasks. For example, in a standard color image, we're going to have three channels, red, green, and blue. And those are going to hold a separate dimension of pixel information. And yeah, these are typically stacked together to produce a three-dimensional representation image, and we're going to call that a tensor. And that's essentially a generalization of a matrix that can accommodate multi-channel structure. To be able to deal with this kind of data, we're going to define convolutional kernels with a depth that matches the number of input channels. Each input channel is going to have its own corresponding layer in the kernel. And then the kernel, so for example, if this was our input, which had two input channels, then our kernel would also have two channels. So they'd both have a depth of 2. And so the kernel is going to perform the convolution separately on each input channel. And then we're going to sum up the results to get the final output. And so the summing process across channels is going to capture features that are consistent across all color layers to allow the network to combine information from the red, green, and blue channels into a single unified output feature map. One problem with multiple output maps is that we've increased the dimensionality of the hidden representation substantially. And to counteract this effect, one thing we can do is only apply the kernel at a certain region using a hyperparameter known as stride. And so stride essentially controls the step size that we take as we slide the kernel over the input image. And so by increasing stride, we're skipping over more and more pixels to reduce the output spatial resolution and to enable to manage the overall number of computations. So for example, if we start with a input image that's been padded with one layer of zeros and define a 2x2 kernel, and then with a stride of 2 and 3, we can, instead of moving 1 pixel at a time, we're only going to pick out certain parts of the input image to apply to the output. And so yeah, by skipping over some of the intermediate pixels, we're going to end up with a smaller output feature map. In this case, a 2x2 grid instead of a 4x4 as we saw before. And so we've discarded some spatial detail by increasing the stride. But what we've managed to do is but because we expect to have a corresponding increase in channel depth because of multiple feature maps, we've kept the overall amount of memory reasonable. So yeah, stride is a practical way to balance the depth of the network with the resolution of its feature maps, and also allows the CNN to focus on larger patterns to capture information more broadly across the image. Understanding the dimensions and parameters in a convolutional neural network is pretty important, especially if you're working with GPUs and you want to pre-allocate memory. And so if each convolution layer processes an input with a specific width Win, height Hin, and depth Din, then the output of the convolution layer is going to depend on a few choices of hyperparameters. First, the number of filters, NK, that's going to determine the depth of the output, as each filter is going to produce its own output channel. Then there's the kernel size. Typically, we're interested in square kernels of size F by F and D in to match the depth of the input. And then padding P, that's going to control the number of extra pixels around the border of the input to allow you to preserve the spatial dimensions or to preserve the spatial dimensions. And then finally, stride to control how much you move the filter across the input image. And so using those hyperparameters, you can then calculate the output dimensions. And so the output width and height are, the output width and height and depth, that's determined by the, we'll focus on the output width first. So that is the input width plus twice the amount of padding minus the size of the kernel, divided by the stride, and then add one. So that's the size of the output. And then the height of the output is determined similarly, assuming a square kernel, and that you've and assuming the same stride along the width and the height. As I said before, the depth of the output is the number of kernels that you've specified. And in terms of the number of trainable parameters, so each filter has a set of trainable parameters, so that's weights and biases. And then the total number of weights in a convolutional layer depends on the number of filters, and then the kernel size. So for a square kernel, that would be F times F, and then the depth of the input. So yeah, that's the number of trainable parameters, number of weights. And then additionally, each filter is going to have its own bias. So that's going to contribute one more parameter per filter. So these biases are going to allow the network to perform an affine transformation of each feature map to allow some flexibility and adaptability in the model's learned representations. So convolution is a powerful operation, but alone it's not sufficient to do the kind of higher level object recognition tasks that you might care about. So as I said, convolution is translation equivariant. So what that means is that if an object in the input image, like a cat, were to shift to a new position, the feature map is going to reflect that shift at the corresponding location. But the convolution is not translation invariant. So on its own, the network's not necessarily, it's not going to recognize that the object is the same regardless of its position. Convolution also doesn't have anything to say or any benefits to robustness to other types of transformations that might show up in object recognition tasks. So yeah, while CNNs can handle translation well, or while convolution can handle translation well, it's going to struggle with other types of variations like rotation or scaling or other types of distortions. So for example, we would want to recognize this as a tiger, regardless of if it's been rotated slightly or stretched. And similarly, we would want to recognize this as a 5, regardless of if it has been rotated. But yeah, so far all we've done with convolution is describe these linear operations, and by themselves, they're not going to provide enough expressive power to handle complex variations in visual data. We're restricted to characterizing an image based on these low-level features. And so these issues actually bring us to the next part of the lecture, which concerns how we move from detecting lower level features to detecting those higher level features in an image. And it turns out that our ability to detect complex features is actually closely related to being invariant to certain types of low-level distortions. And so to understand how that works, Let's recall the foundational work from Hubel and Wiesel that mapped out the hierarchy of visual processing, or that we're pretty foundational in mapping out the hierarchy of visual processing in the brain. Yeah, so their experiments showed that the visual cortex is organized in layers, where each layer extracts progressively more complex features from the visual input, starting with the simple lines, and then building up to more intricate shapes and objects. And so crucially, pooling played an essential role. So there were these complex cells that pooled information from simple cells to achieve some invariance to orientation. And then cells at the next level combined information from multiple complex cells to recognize combinations of lines that form more complex patterns. And so and then by pooling information from cells that detected these combinations, we could eventually work ourselves up to more complex object recognition. So yeah, the computational capabilities of a system that connected simple cells and complex cells in this way, these were explored by and formalized by Kunihiko Fukushima in 1980. Fukushima's neocognitron was one of the earliest artificial neural network models designed specifically for pattern recognition. He was inspired by Hubel and Wiesel's discoveries and went on to create a network that implemented both simple cells and complex cells, and then layered them to form a hierarchy that was capable of pretty complex feature detection. The model laid the essential groundwork for modern convolutional neural networks. So this schematic here, this is a simplified diagram of the neocognitron's architecture. So the signal flows from left to right and through levels, L0 through L3. And then each level, in turn, is composed by two layers that are connected in a cascade. And so the first layer of the level is called the S layer. And then the second layer of a given level is called the C layer. And that corresponds to complex cells. So the input level, L0, this is actually the retina. It receives the raw input image, potentially by means of an array of photodetectors. Then in the first level, the first layer of simple cells, they're going to detect those specific low-level features in small patches of the input, such as those edges or lines at particular orientations. These cells that lie in the S layer, they act as the filters to enable them to respond to a small area of the image based on features they've learned to recognize. And so for the sake of simplicity, only one cell is shown in each plane. But it's taken that the cells in the cell plane have input synapses with the same kind of spatial distribution. And so after detecting these basic features, complex cells are going to perform a type of pooling to receive input from multiple simple cells that detect the same feature but in slightly different positions. A couple comments. So the neocognitron is trained in an unsupervised fashion. And during training, only the connection from C cells to S cells are modified. So the network learned which features to extract. In other words, the connections from the S cells to the C cells, these are fixed. And then as we go deeper in the network, this process of feature extraction by S cells and then spatial pooling by C cells, that's repeated at every single level. So for example, from S2 to C2 in level 2, and then from S3 to C3 in level 3. But when we move from one level to the next, the S cells, they're going to receive input from multiple outputs of C cells at the previous level via cross connections. And so the next level processes these slightly position tolerant pooled features and integrates them into higher level features. And so, yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit more in the next few slides, but the idea is that this hierarchical processing is going to enable the network to build up a representation of the input pattern in a step-by-step manner. And so we're going to move from local features to global structures towards, capturing increasingly abstract patterns as we go from the first levels to the higher levels. So the architecture of the neocognitron positions it to achieve some interesting forms of invariance. And we're going to start off with talking about the most basic one, which is translation invariance. And it's going to do this through a combination of feature detection and then pooling. So let's suppose that an uppercase letter A is presented in the visual field. And so at the first level, there's going to be S cells that act as those feature detectors. And so these features are going to be very low level features. All they can do is recognize the tip of an A. But then next, there's going to be C cells that aggregate responses from a set of nearby S cells. So for example, this aggregation might mean that it produces the same output regardless of which of these 9 cells fired. So the C cell here might be watching this set of 9 S cells. And so each of these S cells is looking for a tip of an A, but it's watching for it in a different part of the field of view. And so, what this means is that if the A were to shift slightly in position, so if it were to shift down, then it would activate a different S cell. So now this one in the middle would be activated instead of this one at the top. But the output of the C cell would be the same because it's aggregating over this entire neighborhood. So now the pooling operation has meant that the network is tolerant to small shifts and changes in the the spatial arrangement of the features. And so we've recognized that the tip of an A is there regardless of where it appeared in the pooled region. And so this is the network now has some degree of translation intolerance to move beyond or translation invariance rather, to move beyond the translation equivariance that was given by convolutional alone. So within a given level, pooling over spatial regions induces that translation invariance. But then as we move from one level to the next, S cells are able to combine feature maps to build latent representations of an object. And so this means that we're combining features across different feature maps so that the network could start to recognize more complex patterns in objects. Suppose we start again with the letter A as input presented to level 0 on the left. In this schematic, we've actually skipped over the processing that occurs at level 1 that we just talked about, and we're gone straight to level 2. So at this stage, let's suppose that each S cell receives signals from all seed planes that came before it. And let's suppose further that the input connections to this sheet of S cells at that layer have been reinforced in such a way that they respond when multiple low-level features are present simultaneously. So for example, the tip of an A, but also the intersection at intersections in the A itself. And then the C cells at that level, they're going to receive input from multiple S cells in a neighborhood. And so that neighborhood is going to be indicated by this circle, this thin line circle here. And so that the C cells are going to tolerate some positional shifts between where exactly those features occurred within the frame. And so then other sheets of C cells might focus on other collections of features. And so, for example, the intersections and the lines, and they're going to confer some positional tolerance. And the C cells are going to confer some positional tolerance there as well. And so, yeah, because of the cascading connections between S cells and C cells, deeper layers are going to combine features from earlier ones. And so as information moves through the network, each successive layer is going to contribute to building an increasingly abstract and invariant representation of the input pattern. The S cells are always going to extract local features, and then the C cells are going to pool these features to tolerate small changes in position. And then by the final level, the receptive field of each C cell becomes large enough to essentially encompass the entire input pattern. And so its response is going to reflect, the entire input pattern, and the network's going to recognize an A regardless of its position. So yeah, by combining the detection of these basic components like edges or corners with detecting the presence of relationships between these features, the neocognitron forms an abstract internal representation of the object. The neocognitron's tolerance for positional shifts also gives it a pretty interesting property, specifically is that it gains robustness to deformation. So it's going to detect an object even if it's enlarged, reduced in size, slightly skewed, thanks to the same mechanism that provides tolerance to positional shifts, actually. So for example, if we had an intermediate S cell that had been trained to recognize a specific pattern composed of three local features that are constituents of an input pattern corresponding to the letter A. So these dotted circles indicate positional tolerance zones around each feature conferred by the C cell in that layer. So that this means that if the local feature were to slightly shift within these zones, then the output at that level would still recognize them as the same feature. So for example, the features could appear at the inner edges of the respective positional tolerance zone. So this would so maybe they were all shifted down or shifted inward. This would correspond to a smaller A, or the features could appear at the outer edges and with some misalignment. And so this would correspond to a larger A that's been skewed a little bit. And so the idea is that as long as each feature remains within its positional tolerance zone, the S cell is going to correctly identify the global shape regardless of slight deviations. Importantly, though, the positional error tolerance can't be too large. So for example, you can imagine the same local features appearing simultaneously, but they've moved so much that they've violated the relationships between them that make the input pattern correspond to an A. And so if such large positional errors were tolerated, the network would actually mistakenly recognize this as an A, even though it clearly is not. And so to prevent this, the neocognitron introduces tolerance gradually across layers rather than all at once. To be able to recognize objects with semantically meaning, to be able to recognize objects that have been distorted in some way without fundamentally destroying what it means to be that same object. The neocognitron was a precursor to convolutional neural networks, and they were first introduced by Ian LeCun in 1989. So this architecture here is known as LeNet, and it was groundbreaking and demonstrated the power of convolutional neural networks in computer vision tasks. LeCun focused on recognition of handwritten digits, and the input to the network was a 28 by 28 binary input image of a digit. And so similar to the neocognitron's design, the architecture alternated between feature extraction performed by convolutions and then pooling. The first layer performs convolution to create 6 feature maps. And these maps act like the simple cells in the neocognitron, detecting the basic features like edges and corners. Each map applies the same set of weights across different regions of the input image to capture spatially relevant features that are consistent across the input. Yeah, and that shared weight structure is what enables convolutional neural networks to recognize patterns irrespective of their locations within the input space. And then at the next stage, a pooling operation is performed. This layer reduces the spatial resolution of the feature maps, limits the computational resources while retaining the essential features. Yeah, and as we said before, the pooling by pooling the network becomes robust to those small shifts and distortions, similar to the pooling operations performed by complex cells in the neocognitron. To make things a little bit confusing, the labeling of layers that have corresponding functional roles have been swapped between the neocognitron and the convolutional neural network. So whereas in the neocognitron, feature extractions were performed by simple cells in the respective S-planes, in the convolutional neural network, feature extraction is performed by convolutions and labeled as the C layers. Similarly, in the neocognitron, pooling was performed by complex cells in the C plane, but in the convolutional neural network, this is referred to as subsampling and accomplished by the S layers. LeNet leveraged the convolutional structure inspired by the neocognitron, but added the powerful tool of backpropagation to train the whole network at once. So that, yeah, this made LeNet one of the first convolutional neural networks to be successfully trained from end to end and achieved impressive accuracy, even rivaling the performance of support vector machines that had come onto the scene at the time. So yeah, the most significant difference between LeNet and the neocognitron was the training method. Neocognitron relied on unsupervised learning, but LeNet leveraged backpropagation to adjust the weights throughout the network all at once. So this allowed LeNet to learn from labeled data and provided a supervised and targeted approach to feature learning. Yeah, final comment is that typically convolutional neural networks, after the convolution and pooling stages, there's also a set of dense layers. So these are traditional multi-layer perceptrons that were fully connected networks. And in order to recognize the final output as one of 10 digits, the final output layer has a dimensionality of 10. Today's neural networks can be thought of in terms of a sequence of convolutional layers. Each consists of a convolution stage, a nonlinear activation, and then a pooling stage. And then these layers work together progressively to extract and transform features from the input towards building out a richer and more abstract representation as the data moves deeper in the network. So the first stage in this process is the convolution stage, and that's where several convolutions are applied in parallel to produce a set of linear activations. So this is the initial transformations to detect those basic patterns in the data by combining pixel values with the kernel's receptive fields. Those convolutionals are linear though, so they don't introduce any complexity beyond the simple filtering. So there's therefore a detector stage where each linear activation is passed through a nonlinear activation function, like the sigmoid or the ReLU. And specifically, the ReLU has become standard in modern convolutional neural networks. Yeah, this stage is crucial because it introduces that nonlinearity needed to model the complex relationships in the data. And then finally, there's a pooling stage, and this summarizes nearby outputs and reduces the spatial resolution. Pooling is what allows the network to generalize across small shifts or variations in the input to enhance its translation invariance. There's a few examples, a few specific types of pooling operations. Max pooling simply selects the maximum value within a region. Average pooling takes the mean. There's another one called L2 norm pooling. So a few different ways to consolidate the information. Essentially, their pooling provides a summary statistic of the neighborhood. Yeah, essentially to downsample the data to control the network's complexity to ensure that the most essential features are passed forward. Yeah, and to drive home this idea of how pooling can induce translational variance, this is yeah, there's a few diagrams here. So this bottom row here represents the activations immediately after the detecting stage. And then the top row shows the results after pooling, specifically max pooling. So each pooling unit in the top row takes the maximum value from a local neighborhood in the bottom row, specifically three pixels. So for example, if the detector stage we're outputting 0.1, 1, 0.2, and 0.1, then this pooling stage here would be monitoring this region. The output of the max pooling would just be 1. Similarly, the output of this max pooling would be 1 and 1 again, and then at the rightmost pixel, it would be just 0.2. In the bottom, this is the same network, but the input has just been shifted 1 pixel to the right. So now 0.1 appears in the second position, 1 appears in the third position, 0.2 in the fourth position, and there's a new pixel, 0.3 at the left. And so whereas all the values in the detector stage have shifted, only half the values in the pooling stage have shifted. And this is because the max pooling only cares about the maximum activation in each neighborhood, not the precise location of that maximum. And so this selective focus on the peak value within each region gives pooling some translational invariance. So the network has been made less sensitive to small displacements. Pooling over spatial regions produces invariance to translation, but there's also pooling across feature maps can enable the network to learn invariance to more complex transformations like rotations. And so this is achieved by training separate convolutional filters, each designed to detect specific variations of the same pattern. So for example, you might have 3 filters specialized to detect different orientations of the handwritten digit 5. And so when a 5 appears in the input, a corresponding filter is going to activate. And then a pooling unit pools across these feature maps to select the strongest activation and produce a robust response. But crucially, the pooling across these feature maps, that's going to produce a robust response, regardless of which filter actually fired. So this type of pooling is going to make the network invariant to transformations like rotation, as the pooling unit is going to output the same result for different variations of the input. This approach is used in an architecture known as max-out network, where the pooling unit combines responses across channels to summarize transformations of the input. By leveraging this principle, convolutional neural networks can efficiently generalize to diverse forms of orientations of objects without needing to learn the variation explicitly at the classification stage. This multi-channel pooling is kind of a complement to the more standard spatial pooling to provide invariance that provides invariance to translation. Our discussion of convolutional neural networks, has really emphasized local processing. But when we stack successive convolution layers, we enable units in deeper layers to have indirect interactions with the entire input image. And so this is because each layer builds on the features detected in the previous one, and it's gradually broadened the field of view or receptive field of the deeper units. And so the further that we go in the network, the more global the feature extraction becomes. And so this allows the network to integrate information from larger parts of the image. And so in this diagram, the bottom layer is, these are the initial input features, so like the pixel values. And then the first hidden layer, those are only going to have, each of those units are going to have connections to specific subsets of the input. So each unit is seeing a local part of the image. By the time we get to the next hidden layer in G, each unit is influenced by multiple inputs from the previous layer, and thereby indirectly connecting them to the entire input space. This cascading structure means that the deeper layers are going to accumulate a broader perspective, and so that the receptive field for these deeper units is going to be considerably larger than those in the shallower layers. So these deeper units are going to cover a large area of the input. These as a result, by the time we get to these final layers, these inputs are going to capture patterns or features that span the entire image. So how can we even go about interpreting the features that are learned by convolutional neural networks? So one way to approach this is to inspect the activations of units in deeper layers in response to particular inputs. So this matrix of images belongs to the ImageNet dataset. And so each row corresponds to a set of images that have elicited similar activity patterns in a particular layer of a modern convolutional neural network called AlexNet. And so within a given row, each of these images, despite clear variations in color, orientation, lighting of the objects that have been presented, the network groups these together because the network has learned to represent them in a shared feature space where these pixel-wise correlations are no longer the primary basis for comparison. And so in this learned feature space, convolutional neural networks achieve invariance to transformations such as changes in position, scale, or background, which are often present in real-world data. And so instead of relying on raw pixel data, the network is going to instead focus on abstract features like the edges, the textures, the shapes, or specific object components that are consistent across images within a class. So for example, the rows here show that the CNN is going to have similar activations when pictures of flowers are presented or pictures of elephants, ships, pumpkins, dogs, even though their pixel level details are going to vary significantly. So this reflects the network's ability to recognize patterns and group inputs based on meaningful features rather than the low-level differences. But yeah, so how does this tie back to object recognition? So convolutional neural networks, they're built to learn and identify features in a structured hierarchical way. And so initially in the shallow layers, CNNs are going to be recognizing those simple patterns like edges or textures. But then as we progress through the layers, these features are going to be combined and leading to a high-level representation of objects in the deeper layers. And then the end result is not just a feature map, but actually a feature vector that represents the image in a high-dimensional feature space, which encodes the most important visual characteristics in a way that is invariant to a lot of transformations that we would consider irrelevant to the task of classification. So for example, this means that if we had images of flowers and pumpkins, these would be mapped to the same feature space. But this space is a learned representation where similar images are close to one another, and dissimilar images are further apart. So for example, flower images would have feature vectors that are close in this space, whereas pumpkins would tend to occupy a different region. So this embedding is what allows CNNs to quantify image similarity based on the underlying features, not raw pixels. So there's a few different ways that convolutional neural networks, their architectures are represented in the literature. So before we go on, it would be good to pause the video to try to absorb this architecture and to be able to make some comments about the information processing that is occurring at each step in the network. Okay, so hopefully you paused the video and tried to make sense of that yourself. And so what's going on here is that we started off with 3-channel inputs of 32 by 32 pixels each. We then applied six feature maps, each of which had a depth of 3 to generate 6 feature maps. We then subsampled that by a factor of 2. So we had 6 feature maps, each with a resolution of 16 by 16. We then applied a set of convolutions to those to get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Okay, so then we applied 12 kernels to give us 12 feature maps, downsampled again to get a resolution of 8. I'm not going to count that out, but we applied a number of other feature maps to increase the depth, and then sampled again to get a 4x4 set of 4x4 feature maps. And then finally, we have 2 MLP output layers. So to condense that down into 500 output units and then 100 units. And so these are dense connections in this final piece. So these are going to be all-to-all connections at the very end. Another way you might see the CNN presented is something like this. So pause the video to see if you can make sense of this one instead. Okay, pretty straightforward. We started off with a 224 by 224 input image, which had 3 color channels. We then blew that up to 64 channels, um, downsampled that to 112 by 112, and then made a series of convolutions to get 128 channels. Did another downsampling operation to get 56 by 56, and then flew that up to get 256 channels. Another downsampling operation, 512 channels, downsample again, 512 channels, and then a final downsampling to get a 7 by 7. So yeah, we're only doing downsampling in these final three. And then now that was, we flattened that to get 4,096. And we finally did a fully connected network at that very end. And we're interested in a 1,000 dimensional softmax on that output. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the lecture. Do a quick summary of what we talked about. So we started off by just the fundamental building blocks of convolution. We went over an example of how convolution takes an input image and a small filter to create an output that highlights certain features. We then went over some examples of useful types of filters that could be used in a convolutional neural network, and how those emphasize certain features within an image. Again, making use of that convolution operation. We then talked about how convolution is implemented in a convolutional neural network, specifically by tying the weights together or using parameter sharing, and then also using those local or sparse connections to actually implement a filter and apply convolution uniformly over a whole image. We also went over, talked about what goes on inside any one of those convolutional layers. So there's the convolution, but then there's also that nonlinearity, and then there's also a pooling operation to perform the downsampling and give us that intolerance or invariance to small positional shifts. We went over a couple examples of convolutional neural network architecture, so a couple ways that you might see them presented in a textbook or in a research paper. And I'd like you to be able to do a couple things with that, specifically to be able to describe the information processing that occurs at the convolutional neural network, given a schematic, but then also given a verbal description, be able to sketch the architecture. And then last but not least, we also went over the dimension, like some calculations of the dimensionality of a convolutional layer, as well as the number of trainable parameters associated with it, given the input dimensions, and then the number of filters, the kernel size, the padding, and the stride. So yeah, hopefully you learned a lot in this lecture. We'll see you back here again next time, where we're going to talk about a different specialized architecture for processing sequences, and that's going to be recurrent neural networks.